2NURFM 103.7. Tuesday is time we have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with our Professor of Politics out of the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, who, Jim, we're rapidly approaching that time. It seems to have crept up on us a little bit. The federal budget not too far from here, and can imagine right now there's a lot of T crossing and I dotting.
Yes, good morning, Mark.
Dollar sign slashing, maybe.
Most of the budget material, most of the decisions and policy endorsements, if you like, have largely been laid out, and they're under wraps at present. But
until the leaks come.
But the government, in building the budget, in putting it all together, has had to be faced with numerous challenges and contradictory demands. And one of the tests for the Albanese government will be how they navigate those contradictions, how they navigate the conflicting demands. They've got a number of big policy issues. And one of the really interesting things about the Albanese government, compared with previous governments, say, of the past 2 decades almost, is there are a number of big projects that the government has got behind, a number of big policy areas that go well past the electoral cycle. So the sorts of things that they're needing or wanting to put in place around defence, around immigration, around some areas of infrastructure, and they're still reviewing that as we speak, around the rebuilding and recalibration of the Australian public service, and also, I guess, about the way in which the Parliament itself operates. So there are a number of big areas, but they went to the election, Mark, with a big Achilles heel, promising action on cost of living. And for a government, that's a really vulnerable area. And if you happen to be the leader of the opposition and you happen to be in opposition, there's not much good things to be said about being in opposition. But one of the advantages is that you don't have to have any necessary responsibility over the sorts of criticisms that you make or the promises that you make in opposing what the government is doing. So Mr. Dutton now has an opportunity to score, probably depending on which side of the boundaries you sit, some cheap political points, but also a chance to perhaps put a dent in the momentum that the Albanese government has at present. So the cost of living, Mark, is a big issue that the government's going to have to face, and it looks very much like there will be a few disappointed areas as a result.
Well, there probably will be. And when you look at, Jim, the phases, there's almost 3 phases, isn't there, from opposition in? And when you're in the opposition, everything's the government's fault, whoever the government of the day. Then you get in, and then for a while, everything's still the previous government's fault. But at some point, that honeymoon turns into real-life marriage and real-life arguments. And I think we might be starting to see not big cracks, but there's certainly some voter resentment we're starting to see. I mean, the turn up in Tasmania over the weekend to announce of all things a football stadium, and there's a lot of angry people down there.
Yes, see, that's one of the sorts of contradictions that the government's facing, and you're quite right. After the first 12 months or so, they can no longer use the excuse, well, it was the other lot's fault. We've inherited all of this. This budget,
it's great for a little while because in effect it's true, whoever you are. But at some point you're like, well, you've had the job for a while now. You've remodeled the furniture in the office, and
this is the budget.
Show me some results. Yeah.
Exactly, Mark. This is the budget where the government, in a sense, takes responsibility for governing in its own right, rather than steering, using the metaphor of the ship, steering that ship based on what course had already been put in place. They're now in a position, as we would expect, to be able to rechart where the Australian ship of state is going. And we've seen some really big announcements around that, and some of these are really quite costly. So there will need to be, and I expect there will be, some trade-offs that the government will make about some of those sorts of promises and the timing and the duration of those. But the issue in Tasmania about the proposed AFL football stadium, something like $300 million, $280 million, I think it was, pledged.
Give or take some change,
from the federal government to in a time when people take Tasmania have a very big problem with homelessness, as does the rest of Australia, by the way. But in Tasmania, it has a particularly sharp edge at present. And for the federal government to then announce they're going to spend $300 million or so on housing fans to watch a football match, and then I think the Prime Minister was a little flippant when he said, well, of course we'll make it accessible so that people who are struggling will still be able to afford to go. Yeah. That's no consolation to those people who are struggling to find somewhere to live and so forth. So some of those sorts of things are going to be bearing down on the government. Unfortunately, again, for the government, they don't have the luxury of being able to solve these problems, in 12 months. Almost everything that they're dealing with now are long-term issues that will take anywhere from 3 to 10 years to actually turn around and into something reasonable. In particular, fixing up homelessness, for example, and trying to ensure that the cost of living doesn't, continue to rise in such a way that people are being negatively impacted too hard, because as we know, the wealthy don't actually suffer these problems.
No, that's always the point. I mean, I think we can accept that. Two things there, though. I think when you're in that campaign phase, you can be a bit smart too. Like the guy that became the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, when was asked cost of living questions, he was saying, look, I'm the Premier. I'm not going to be able to solve this for you. And that was seen as a bone of honesty. But when you're the now incoming Prime Minister, a year ago, the $275 that we're going to cut that off your power bill, and clearly that hasn't happened and won't happen. It's seen as something a bit different. But lastly, Jim, on the idea of this is the first budget for this government, the new government, when you sort of knew the first one's kind of that, well, if we're going to do anything bad or tougher, that's the time to do it. The sweetener's late. They don't have that luxury either because,
well, they're over a year or just over a year into government now. So they're not in a position, in a sense, to do the really, shall we say, vicious tough love. But they will probably be making, or most definitely they'll be making some tough decisions. And these, there will be segments of the community, parts of industry, parts of the workforce that will be negatively impacted, i.e. they won't get the handout that they're expecting, or the mitigation of cost of living is not going to be such that it makes much difference to people's lives. I mean, just turning around aged care issues, money needs to be invested in that, and it's not clear that the government is going to do a whole lot about that at this stage. However, we'll wait and see on that, Mark. But basically, the choices the government makes, I guess, are going to be partly driven by electoral needs. But like I said, one of the big features of the Albanese government has been looking to policy decisions that are going to have much longer term impacts. And so the political art for the Albanese government is to sell whatever it is that comes down in the budget as being laying the foundations, as being a necessary step. And not everything we want we can have. That's basically the sort of mantra that they need to be able to say. We can't have everything we want just because we want it. We need to be responsible about how this operates. Unfortunately, politically, pursuing that responsibility sometimes means that the government doesn't necessarily get the right policy mix, or it doesn't get the right funding formula organised, and it ends up with it impacting in negative ways that they hadn't really counted on. So for the government, it's a case of, yes, we're going to make necessary decisions here, but it's all they've got to sell that, whatever the budget is, in terms of the best outcome for the country.
I'll tell you what, if they can do that, they're geniuses on the back of the fact with the power stuff we've mentioned, general cost of living. For those at the upper end, probably no stage 3 tax cuts. For everybody else, the $12 to $1,500 rebate in your tax is probably going, and no rise that we can see for those on unemployment. So that doesn't leave a lot of happy faces left here.
Well, no, Mark. And
to be honest, it just doesn't.
In part, and we're running out of time, I realise, but in part, they're rolling back or needing to roll back some of the middle class welfare and corporate welfare that had been built up over a couple of decades, and things that were put in place that were short-term measures are now needing to be wound up or pulled back. But of course, once you get a short-term cash injection coming in every week for 12 months or however long, and then someone says we're going to stop that now because it's no longer justified. Hang on a second, that's coming out of what I thought I was expecting each week. So there are those problems that rolling back middle-class welfare in order to have a more balanced approach it was going to cause a little bit of pain, and the government has to figure out how they can minimise that and while appearing to live up to their election promise.
I don't know that long term. I don't know they can sell it. Once people start seeing, you go to the tax man and go, well, you're going to have a $1,200 to $1,500 net loss, regardless of what we want to call. That's a reality, and all the others. Hey, if they can do that, they're geniuses, and I'd like to have. We'll see what happens, Jim, in a week or so, eh?
Well, exactly. We'll see what Mr. Chalmers can bring down, and whether he's got the political nous to sell it.
Well, that's what it's all about. Jim, we'll see what happens. Thanks for your time, mate. We'll talk to you next time here.
My pleasure, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics out of the University of Newcastle, Jim Jose, on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.